They took the gold, legally. Picture this. April 5th, 1933. You're an American. You own gold coins. Legal gold coins you earned, saved, and stored inside your own home. And this morning, the President of the United States made that a federal crime. Not a technicality, not a gray area, a crime punishable by 10 years in prison and a fine of $10,000. That's roughly $230,000 in today's money. You have until May 1st, less than 4 weeks, to hand over your gold to the nearest Federal Reserve Bank. In exchange, you receive paper, $20.67 per troy ounce. The government sets the price. You don't negotiate. You comply or you go to prison. And here's the part that almost nobody talks about. The government didn't take your gold to protect you. It took your gold to protect itself. And then, 8 months later, it did something that reveals exactly what was really happening. Something so brazen that when you understand the full sequence, it reframes every conversation you've ever had about gold, savings, and what governments actually do when the pressure gets real. This is the forensic record of the single largest legal seizure of private gold in American history, and the playbook hasn't changed. Let me show you what actually happened. Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102 on April 5, 1933. The country was in the grip of the Great Depression. Bank runs had been cascading across the nation for months. In February alone, Michigan, Indiana, Maryland, Arkansas, and Ohio had either declared bank holidays or imposed withdrawal limits. People were scared, and scared people were doing something rational. They were converting their paper dollars into gold coins and getting out of the banking system entirely. That behavior was destroying the Federal Reserve's ability to expand the money supply. Here's why. Under the gold standard still in force at the time, every dollar in circulation had to be backed by a corresponding reserve of gold. If citizens were draining gold out of the system, the Fed's hands were tied. It could not print more money to reflate the economy. Gold in private hands was, from the government's perspective, gold that had escaped the system. So the government made that escape illegal. Executive Order 6102 required all persons in the United States to deliver to the Federal Reserve all gold coin, gold bullion, and gold certificates. The exceptions were narrow: jewelry, dental uses, industrial uses, artists' materials, numismatic coins with recognized collector value, and a small amount, 5 ounces per person, for practical use. Everything else had to go. By May 1st, for $20.67 per ounce. The order didn't whisper, it announced itself with the full weight of the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917. Originally passed to control financial transactions with enemy nations during World War I, the act had never been repealed. Roosevelt's team argued, successfully, that the economic crisis constituted a national emergency that authorized its use against American citizens. The legal argument was audacious. The country is not at war, but you are the enemy if you hold gold. The penalties were not symbolic. Section 9 of the Gold Reserve Act that followed in January 1934 codified them explicitly. A 10-year prison sentence, a $10,000 fine, for the crime of holding your own savings in the asset that had served as real money for 5,000 years. Now stop here, because this is the moment the story changes from economic history to forensic psychology. The government needed compliance. The gold was spread across millions of households. There was no practical mechanism to search every home, every safe deposit box, every floorboard. Enforcement depended entirely on voluntary surrender mixed with the credible threat of legal consequences. So here is the question that matters. Who actually complied? The documented record shows that the overwhelming majority of ordinary law-abiding Americans did exactly what they were told. They walked into their local Federal Reserve branch. They handed over their gold. They accepted the paper. They trusted the institution. The people who didn't comply fell into a narrow category. Those with the sophistication to see what was actually happening. Those with connections to move assets outside the jurisdiction before the order took effect. Those who had, quietly and without fanfare, already positioned themselves differently. The pattern looks identical to what we documented in Weimar Germany, where the gold was gone before the crisis through a patriotic donation campaign. The mechanism is different. The psychology is the same. Ordinary people trust institutions. Ordinary people comply. Ordinary people absorb the loss. Now here is the detail that changes everything.
For 8 months after the confiscation, gold sat in Federal Reserve vaults, acquired at $20.67 per ounce. In January 1934, Roosevelt signed the Gold Reserve Act. The act authorized the government to revalue gold. The new official price was set at $35 per ounce. Let that land. The government bought your gold at $20.67. Then it revalued that same gold to $35. Overnight, by decree, a 69% increase in the stated value of every ounce it had collected. The profit on that revaluation didn't go back to the citizens who surrendered the gold. It stayed in the Treasury. It became the monetary base for a new expansion of the dollar supply. This was not an accident. This was not an unforeseen consequence. The revaluation was the point. The confiscation and the revaluation were a single two-step mechanism. Step 1. Acquire the asset at a price you control. Step 2. Revalue the asset upward and keep the difference. The citizen who surrendered an ounce of gold at $20 watched the government book that same ounce at $35. The citizen never saw the difference. If you held onto your gold through the confiscation order privately and illegally, that ounce of gold was suddenly worth 69% more the moment the revaluation occurred. The legal risk was real. The upside for those who had taken it was also real. The government understood both sides of this calculation when it designed the order. The forensic record doesn't say this was unique to America. It says America was one instance of a pattern repeated across governments on multiple continents, across multiple decades, always following the same architecture. Britain never announced a dramatic gold confiscation. It didn't need to. The Defense of the Realm Act of 1917 quietly prohibited hoarding of gold and silver. British subjects were forbidden from buying gold for any purpose other than industrial or decorative use. By the time the crisis had passed, the private gold holdings that had existed in 1914 had been systematically drawn into official reserves, not through one dramatic order, through accumulated legal pressure over years. The result was the same. Australia followed in 1959. The Banking Act of that year required holders of gold coins to surrender them to the Reserve Bank at a government-set price. Gold sovereigns that had been in Australian families for generations became illegal to hold without specific exemption. India's Gold Control Act of 1968 went further. Citizens were prohibited from owning gold bars or coins entirely. The act survived for 22 years, creating a parallel black market economy around the one asset Indians had trusted longer than any government that tried to take it. Each case shares the same logic. A government facing financial pressure confronts a problem. Its citizens hold an asset it cannot print. That asset in private hands is a constraint on the government's ability to manage the money supply. The solution is to make private ownership illegal, acquire it at a price the government controls, and use it as backing for whatever monetary expansion the government needs. The language used is always emergency language, always temporary, always framed as a shared national sacrifice. The defense of the fatherland, the New Deal, national economic stability. The framing changes, the mechanism doesn't. Here is the specific detail that matters most for this channel. The confiscation is never announced in advance. It arrives as a fait accompli. You wake up one morning and it has already happened. Roosevelt's order was signed on a Wednesday. It was announced to the public the same day. Citizens had less than 4 weeks to comply. There was no prior warning. There was no public debate. There was a signature, a deadline, and a penalty. The people who had positioned themselves before that Wednesday were in a different situation than those who started thinking about it after the announcement. This is not a subtle distinction. It is the entire distinction. The forensic record from every documented confiscation points to the same conclusion. The window between visible warning signs and the actual order is measured in weeks, not years. What were the visible warning signs before April 1933? They are documented and specific. Roosevelt had been openly discussing gold hoarding and the banking crisis since the campaign. Multiple states had already imposed emergency banking restrictions in the weeks before the order was signed. The Federal Reserve had been bleeding gold reserves for months. The newspaper coverage of the March bank holiday used language that made the connection between gold hoarding and systemic instability reality explicit. Every warning was visible to anyone paying attention. Most people were not paying attention. They were coping with daily survival in the worst economic contraction in American history. The people who were paying attention made decisions in February and early March that looked very different from the decisions available after the order was signed. Now the part that almost no one has thought through. Executive Order 6002 was signed in 1933. The ban on private gold ownership remained in place for 40 years. It was not until December 31st, 1974 that it became legal again for American citizens to own gold without restriction. 40 years. An entire generation of Americans lived their entire adult lives under a legal regime in which owning gold was a federal crime. Here is what the forensic record says about the current situation. The legal architecture for gold confiscation does not need to be rebuilt from scratch. The Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917, the statute Roosevelt used, was amended and updated but never fully repealed. The International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977 gives the president broad authority to regulate or prohibit financial transactions, including transactions in precious metals, during any declared national emergency. The legal framework that permitted the 1933 confiscation has successors, updated versions, broader in some ways, that are currently in force. No gold confiscation is underway in the United States right now. This is not an argument that one is imminent. It is something different and more important. It is the forensic observation that the legal machinery is not dormant. It is maintained, updated, and available. Central banks globally have purchased more than 1,000 tons of gold in each of the last 3 consecutive years, double the pace of the prior decade. These are not the actions of institutions that believe gold is irrelevant. These are the actions of institutions accumulating the asset that private citizens are being culturally encouraged to trade in ETFs, in paper contracts, in digital accounts, rather than hold physically. The Federal Reserve holds approximately 8,100 tons of gold, the largest national gold reserve in the world. It has not sold a significant amount in decades. The institution that acquired American citizens' gold in 1933 and revalued it at a 69% premium still holds physical metal as its foundational reserve asset, while the citizens whose grandparents surrendered it hold dollars. This is not a conspiracy. It is the documented record of how governments think about gold versus how they encourage citizens to think about gold. The distinction is not subtle. The forensic breakdown from the 1933 confiscation points to 3 things that held and 3 things that didn't. Physical gold held outside the banking system and outside domestic jurisdiction held its value absolutely. An American citizen who had moved gold holdings to Switzerland or held gold in Canada prior to April 5, 1933 was not subject to the order. The order was territorial. It applied to persons within the United States. The people who had understood that sovereign risk to an asset means risk from the sovereign over the territory where the asset is held had already acted. Foreign-held gold remained intact. Foreign-held gold appreciated 69% when the revaluation occurred. Productive farmland and real assets with income that didn't depend on the monetary system continued functioning through the confiscation and the revaluation. The farmer who owned his land in 1933 had a farm in 1934. The revaluation of gold didn't change the productivity of the soil. The reorganization of the monetary system didn't change the caloric value of corn.
Practical skills and local exchange relationships persisted through every stage of the Depression, through the confiscation, and through the stabilization that followed. The carpenter, the physician, the farmer, the mechanic, the people whose value was expressed in what they could do, not in what their account balance said. What didn't hold? Paper currency held in domestic banks lost purchasing power through the inflationary expansion enabled by the confiscation. The entire purpose of acquiring private gold was to allow monetary expansion. That expansion transferred purchasing power from holders of paper savings to the government that controlled the money supply. The mechanism is the same one documented in Rome, in Weimar Germany, in Venezuela. Only the method of acquisition differs. Government bonds and financial instruments denominated in dollars lost real value even as their nominal face value was maintained. The holder of a dollar-denominated bond received the dollars promised. Those dollars bought less than before the gold was confiscated and the money supply was expanded. And here is the line that closes the autopsy. The people who lost the most were not reckless gamblers. They were the most cautious, most rule-following, most institution-trusting members of the middle class. They held their savings in dollars because dollars were the official currency. They held their savings in domestic banks because that was the prudent, legal, advised thing to do. They surrendered their gold when the order came because they were law-abiding citizens who trusted that the emergency would pass and the institutions would protect them. The farmer didn't lose much. He had land. The Swiss bank account holder didn't lose the gold. It was outside the jurisdiction. The ordinary urban saver who had done everything right by every rule he had ever been taught handed his gold to a Federal Reserve teller on a Tuesday morning in April 1933 and received paper worth 69% less than the gold he would have been holding 8 months later. History records his compliance as virtuous. The forensic record records its consequence as a transfer of real wealth from the people who trusted the institution to the institution they trusted. Marcus, the silversmith in Antioch in 260 AD, could feel the weight of the debased coins in his palm and understand that something was being taken from him. The American saver in 1933 couldn't feel the revaluation happening after the fact. The metal was already gone. The paper was already in his hands. The 69% difference between the price he received and the price the government booked existed only in ledgers he never saw. That is what makes legal confiscation more effective than illegal confiscation. It happens with your cooperation. It happens with your signature on the surrender form. It happens with your understanding that this is temporary, necessary, and in the national interest. The question the forensic record always asks is not whether a government with sufficient legal authority and sufficient fiscal pressure will reach for the private savings of its citizens. The answer to that across every major documented case is consistent. The question is only whether you understand the mechanism clearly enough to have positioned yourself before the reach extends. The people who held gold outside the territorial jurisdiction of the United States in April 1933 kept their gold and gained 69% when the revaluation hit. The people who held gold inside American soil on that Wednesday morning had 4 weeks to comply with the law or risk a federal prison sentence. Both groups had read the same newspapers. Both groups had access to the same public information. The difference was not intelligence. It was whether they had taken the documented history of government behavior under financial pressure seriously enough to act on it before the moment of crisis made acting clearly impossible. If this forensic breakdown gave you a new lens on what governments actually do with private gold under pressure, subscribe to Independent Financial Historian. This channel examines the documented record, not the version of history that makes institutions look like protectors of your savings. The version that shows what the ledgers actually say when the emergency orders get signed. Drop a hammer and anvil in the comments if you're already thinking about what the current legal architecture means for how you hold assets. Tell me what you want me to dig into next. I read every one. And remember what the documented record of April 5, 1933 shows clearly. They didn't break into your house. They passed a law. They set a deadline. They relied on your compliance. And then they revalued what they took at 69% above what they paid you for it. Legal. Documented. And if you understand the mechanism, entirely predictable.